How the Book of Enoch was known in the time of Jesus without acceptance or trust. It was not scripture, but everyone had heard of it. That is the strange, unsettling truth about the Book of Enoch in the world of first-century Judea. It was copied by hand, carried across deserts, read in stone chambers and mud-walled homes, debated in synagogues, and whispered about in marketplaces. And yet it sat at the edge of something. Not quite sacred, not quite condemned, not quite forgotten. Most people today, when they think about the Bible Jesus read, imagine a clean, settled collection of texts, agreed upon, authoritative, uncontested. But what if the library of the ancient Jewish world was far more complicated than that? What if there were books that hovered at the boundary of the sacred, books that shaped how people thought, how they prayed, how they feared the night sky, without ever being fully trusted? What did it mean for a text to exist in that borderland? Who read it? Who feared it? Who quoted it without attribution? And what does it reveal about the world Jesus walked through, the people he spoke to, the language he chose? Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels and how we understand the spiritual world Jesus inhabited. To understand the Book of Enoch's place in first-century Judea, you have to first understand what a text was in that world. Not a book in the modern sense, bound, printed, identical in every copy. A text was a physical object of enormous labor. Imagine a scroll made from the skin of an animal, scraped thin, stretched, dried under desert sun until it became pale and smooth as old bone, then ruled with a stylus, faint lines pressed into the surface, so that letters could march in disciplined rows across the column. To own a scroll was to own something costly. To copy one required weeks of trained work. A scribe sat in a fixed posture, reed pen dipped in carbon black ink, his breath controlled, his hand moving with the deliberate pressure of a craftsman who knew that a single error might require the entire column to be abandoned. The smell of the scriptorium, if you can call it that in a modest Judean setting, was the smell of animal skin, lamp oil, and dry ink. The sound was near silence. Breath, the soft drag of reed on parchment, the occasional scratch of a correction. This matters enormously, because in a world where texts were rare, expensive, and laboriously reproduced, the decision to copy a particular work was never casual. It was a statement of value. Someone believed this text was worth the skin of an animal, weeks of a scribe's life, and the space it would occupy in a community's collection. And the Book of Enoch, or portions of it, was being copied extensively. We know this because of what was found in the caves above the Dead Sea in 1947 and the years that followed. Among the scrolls recovered at Qumran, that austere, wind-scoured settlement on the northwestern edge of the Dead Sea, fragments of the Book of Enoch were found in multiple copies, in Aramaic, predating anything scholars had previously seen. 11 copies, more than almost any other non-Torah text at the site. Someone there had valued this book enough to reproduce it again and again. But Qumran was not Jerusalem. It was not Galilee. It was not the marketplaces of Capernaum or the synagogues of Nazareth. It was a separatist community. Scholars debate exactly who they were, but they almost certainly stood at a significant remove from mainstream Jewish life. Their relationship to texts, including the Book of Enoch, was their own. Yet the influence of Enoch did not stop at the edge of the desert. The Book of Enoch claimed to be ancient, older than Moses, older than the law. It claimed to record the visions and journeys of Enoch, the seventh patriarch from Adam, the man described in Genesis with that haunting brevity. He walked with God, and then he was not, for God took him. That single sentence in the Hebrew text was an open door. What did it mean that God took him? Where did he go? What did he see? Into that silence, the Book of Enoch spoke at great length. It described Enoch ascending through the layers of heaven, standing before a throne of fire so brilliant that no description could fully contain it, receiving the secrets of the cosmos, the movements of stars, the cycles of the sun and moon, the architecture of the heavenly realms, the identities and roles of angels. And it told a story that sat at the very edge of the Genesis narrative, the story of the Watchers. In Genesis 6, there is a passage so compressed it has puzzled readers for millennia. A few verses about the sons of God descending to earth, taking human wives, producing giants known as the Nephilim, and triggering a great divine judgment. It is over almost before it begins. The text moves on, but the Book of Enoch did not move on. It stopped there and expanded that fragment into an elaborate drama. The rebellion of angelic beings, their corruption of humanity, their punishment, the groaning of the earth under the weight of their violence, and the cries of human souls rising to heaven, unanswered, until God finally sent the flood. This was not theology written in the abstract. It was narrative, urgent, detailed, emotionally immediate, and it addressed questions that ordinary people in first-century Judea were still asking, urgently, in the dark. Where does evil come from? Why does the innocent suffer? Are there forces in the unseen world working against human flourishing? Will God answer? And when? These were not academic questions. They were the questions of families who had watched Roman soldiers march through their villages, of farmers who had lost harvests to drought and still owed taxes to an occupying power, of mothers whose sons had disappeared into the machinery of imperial justice, of priests who performed the temple rituals with perfect precision and still could not explain why the righteous continued to suffer. The Book of Enoch spoke to all of it. And that is why, even without canonical status, even without the formal acceptance that the Torah commanded, it lived. It breathed in the imagination of first-century Judea like smoke through a cracked wall, present, invisible, impossible to fully ignore. The synagogue in a Galilean village was not a grand structure. In the first century, it was often a repurposed room, a large house with its interior walls removed, stone benches lining the sides, a raised platform at the center where the scroll would be unrolled and read aloud. The floor was packed earth or rough stone. The light came through small windows set high in the walls, cutting the interior into bars of gold and shadow. In winter, the cold pressed in from every direction. In summer, the heat was a physical weight. Men gathered there on the Sabbath not only to hear the Torah read, but to discuss it, to argue it, to push against its edges. The synagogue of the first century was not a place of passive reception. It was a place of active, sometimes heated interpretation. A traveling teacher could stand and offer a reading. Questions would be asked. Challenges would come from the benches. The community's understanding of sacred texts was built through this friction, week after week, generation after generation. In this environment, texts that were not Torah still circulated. They circulated the way ideas always circulate in a community without mass media, through conversation, through memory, through the careful repetition of passages that had lodged themselves in someone's mind and refused to leave. A man might not own a copy of the Book of Enoch. He might never have held the scroll in his hands. But he could have heard its language, its images, its cadences, its particular way of describing the heavenly world, passed down through someone who had read it, or through someone who had heard it read, in a chain of transmission that stretched back generations. This is how ideas moved in antiquity, not through distribution, but through absorption. A phrase enters the mind of a reader. That reader speaks it aloud in conversation. Another person carries it away without knowing its source. By the time it surfaces again, it has lost its attribution but kept its shape. The language of Enoch was particularly susceptible to this kind of migration. Its imagery was vivid and irreducible. The Son of Man seated on a throne of glory, surrounded by the holy ones, presiding over a final judgment in which the mighty are brought low and the righteous are vindicated. The heavenly books in which human deeds are recorded, the angels with names and specific functions, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel, each governing a portion of creation with precise, almost bureaucratic responsibility. Gehenna described not merely as a metaphor, but as a physical place of fire, where the condemned experience the weight of their choices. These images did not originate solely with Enoch. They drew on earlier traditions, on Ezekiel, on Daniel, on threads woven through the Hebrew prophetic imagination, but Enoch gathered them, elaborated them, gave them narrative flesh. And that flesh entered the bloodstream of Second Temple Judaism and did not leave. Consider what a Galilean farmer in the 1st century would have understood when he heard the phrase, Son of Man. Not as a scholar parsing its Danielic origins, but as a person formed by the full texture of his tradition. The Book of Enoch had used that phrase extensively, in a specific and weighty sense, a pre-existent heavenly figure, chosen before the creation of the world, who would appear at the end of days to judge the living and the dead, to overturn the structures of oppression, to vindicate those who had suffered unjustly. This was not an abstraction. It was a figure with a face, almost, a presence that people had been imagining, debating, and half expecting for generations. When Jesus stood in Galilee and used the phrase Son of Man in reference to himself, consistently, deliberately, in contexts that evoked judgment, authority, suffering, and vindication, he was not introducing a blank term. He was stepping into a conversation already thick with meaning. The question is not whether the people around him had read Enoch. The question is whether Enoch's language had already shaped the imaginative world through which they heard everything. The evidence suggests it had. This is where the borderland status of the Book of Enoch becomes theologically fascinating rather than merely historically interesting. A text does not need canonical authority to shape a culture's imagination. It needs only to be present, repeated, and emotionally resonant. And Enoch was all three. But that presence was complicated, because even among those who knew the book, who had absorbed its images, who found its answers compelling, there was hesitation. There was a word used in Jewish tradition for texts that occupied this uncertain space, Sepharim Hitsonim, outside books, external books, books that were read, that circulated, that were not condemned outright, but that carried no authoritative weight. Books you could know without being required to believe. Books you could quote without citing. Books that lived at the margin of the sacred, where curiosity and caution met. The Pharisees, who were the dominant interpretive force in the synagogues of Galilee and Judea, maintained a complex relationship with texts like Enoch. They affirmed the resurrection of the dead, a doctrine that had no explicit foundation in the Torah, but drew heavily on the later prophetic and apocalyptic literature, the tradition Enoch represented. They believed in angels with names and functions. They held a developed sense of final judgment and divine accounting. In all of this, they were closer to the world Enoch described than the Sadducees, who rejected all of it. Yet the Pharisees did not canonize Enoch. They did not place it beside Isaiah or the Psalms. They used its ideas, breathed its atmosphere, and kept it at arm's length, simultaneously shaped by it and unwilling to be defined by it. This ambivalence was not hypocrisy. It was the natural posture of a tradition trying to hold its boundaries while remaining alive to the full range of its spiritual inheritance. The book was known. The book was influential. The book was not trusted in the sense that authority was granted to it. And this meant that when its ideas appeared in teaching, as they did constantly, they appeared without attribution, absorbed into the broader current of Jewish thought, without anyone needing to say, "This comes from Enoch." In this world, Jesus taught. He knew the texture of this tradition. He addressed people whose imagination had been formed by texts both canonical and external, by stories both authoritative and peripheral. He spoke in a language his hearers already partially understood, and then pushed that language past where it had ever gone before. There is a village well in the middle of a Galilean town, and around it, in the early morning, women gather. The sound is the creak of rope against stone, the slap of water, the low murmur of conversation that has been happening in this spot for generations. The air carries the smell of dust and animal, and the faint sweetness of water drawn cold from underground. This is where news traveled. This is where language lived before it found its way into formal spaces. In this world, the stories that shaped people were not confined to the synagogue. They moved through domestic space, through the grinding of grain, through the tending of oil lamps, through the long hours of shepherding on hillsides where a man had nothing but sky and thought for company. In those hours, the questions that apocalyptic literature addressed were not abstract. They were immediate. They pressed in from every direction. A shepherd lying on a hillside at night in first-century Galilee looked up at a sky that was not the sky we see. There was no ambient light to wash the stars into faintness. The Milky Way was a physical presence, a river of cold fire arching from horizon to horizon. The stars moved in patterns that the ancient world had observed for millennia, patterns that felt like language, like intention. The Book of Enoch had a great deal to say about the stars. It described their movements as the obedience of created beings, angels assigned to their courses, never deviating, never failing, rising and setting with the precision of servants who knew their master's will exactly. This was not merely poetic. In a world without mechanical timekeeping, the stars governed everything. The agricultural calendar, the religious calendar, the timing of festivals, all of it depended on the accurate observation of celestial movement. A farmer who missed the window of planting because he had miscalculated the season could lose everything. A community whose calendar drifted out of alignment with the actual movements of sun and moon found its festivals celebrated at the wrong moment, its religious life subtly disordered. The stars were not decoration. They were infrastructure, and the Book of Enoch treated them as such. One of its major sections, scholars call it the astronomical book, is a detailed, methodical account of the movements of sun, moon, and stars, framed as divine revelation given to Enoch during his heavenly journey. It described a solar calendar of 364 days, ordered and exact, in contrast to the lunar calendar that mainstream Judaism used. This was not an idle difference. It was a point of genuine controversy, and communities like the one at Qumran organized their entire religious life around the Enochic solar calendar, celebrating festivals on different days than the Jerusalem temple establishment. A text that could determine when you celebrated Passover was not a marginal curiosity. It was a document with real stakes: social, religious, communal. And yet even this practical relevance did not translate into canonical acceptance. The astronomical book circulated. It influenced. It divided communities. And it remained outside. This pattern, influence without authority, presence without trust, shaped the specific way people related to Enoch's most charged content, its account of the fallen angels and the origin of evil. Walk into a first-century Judean home and look at the doorpost. There, in a small container called a mezuzah, a portion of the Torah is sealed. Deuteronomy's command to love God with heart, soul, and strength, and to bind these words on the doorpost of the house. This was protection. This was boundary marking. This was the physical declaration that the God of Israel governed this threshold and everything within it. Why did people need such protection? Because the world outside that threshold was understood to be populated by forces that were not neutral, not simply indifferent nature, but active, spiritual hostility, sickness that came without warning, madness that descended on the young, infants who died before they could be named, crops that failed despite careful tending. The ancient world did not explain these things through biology or meteorology. It explained them through the presence of malevolent spiritual forces, beings that wished humanity harm, that moved through the world seeking points of entry. The Book of Enoch had an elaborate account of where these forces came from. When the Watchers, the angelic beings who had descended to earth and corrupted humanity, were destroyed in the flood, their offspring, the Nephilim, were also destroyed in body, but their spirits, according to Enoch, did not die. They remained. They roamed the earth as what the text called evil spirits, beings without bodies, seeking embodiment, causing sickness, confusion, and moral corruption wherever they found a willing host or an unprotected human being. This was not a fringe idea confined to the desert community at Qumran. Versions of this understanding of disembodied evil spirits appear throughout Second Temple Jewish literature. In the Book of Jubilees, in the Testament of Solomon, in various texts that circulated widely across the Jewish world. The specific Enochic framing that these spirits were the disembodied souls of the Nephilim, the offspring of fallen angels, was one account among several, but it was a compelling one, because it gave evil a history. It explained not only that malevolent forces existed, but why they existed, where they came from, and why the world had not been rid of them. In this imaginative world, exorcism was not a strange or peripheral practice. It was a logical response to a real problem: the presence of beings that did not belong in the human body they had entered, that needed to be commanded out by someone with sufficient authority. When Jesus cast out demons in the synagogue at Capernaum, and the text of Mark makes clear that this happened early, publicly, in front of a crowd that watched with astonished attention. He was doing something that the people around him already had a framework to understand. But what astonished them was not that he did it. What astonished them was how he did it. With a word. No ritual, no formula, no extended negotiation. He spoke, and the Spirit obeyed. The crowd said, "What is this? A new teaching, with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." The word they used, authority, in Greek exousia, was precisely the word that mattered. The world Enoch described was a world of ranked spiritual powers, each with designated authority over specific domains. The Watchers had transgressed the limits of their authority and been punished for it. The evil spirits that roamed the earth operated within limits. They could be resisted, commanded, expelled, if the one doing the commanding had legitimate authority to do so. Jesus commanded them as if that authority were simply, naturally, completely his. For people formed by Enoch's imaginative world, people who understood the spiritual hierarchy, the fallen powers, the groaning of creation under the weight of transgression. This was not merely impressive, it was cosmically significant. It suggested that the figure standing before them operated from a level of authority that no human teacher, no rabbi, no exorcist working formulas had ever demonstrated. It raised a question that the Book of Enoch had prepared them to ask, even if nothing in their tradition had prepared them to answer it. Who, exactly, was this man? There is a moment in the letter of Jude, one of the shortest texts in the entire New Testament, easy to overlook, easy to read past, where something extraordinary happens. Jude, writing to warn his community against false teachers who have crept in among them, reaches for an illustration. He wants to describe the certainty of divine judgment, the inevitability of accountability for those who corrupt what is holy. And he quotes, directly, by name. He quotes the Book of Enoch. Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about these people. See, the Lord is coming with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment on all, and to convict everyone of all the deeds of ungodliness that they have committed in such an ungodly way. This is not a paraphrase, it is not a loose allusion, it is a direct citation, with attribution, lifted from the first Book of Enoch, with the precision of a writer who knows exactly where he is drawing from and considers it worth naming. Jude does not apologize for it. He does not qualify it. He presents Enoch's words as prophecy, using the same term applied to Isaiah, to Jeremiah, to the great voices of the Hebrew tradition. And then, a few verses later, Jude does it again, this time alluding to Enoch's account of the angels who abandoned their proper dwelling and are kept in eternal chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. The imagery is unmistakably Enochic. The theology is drawn directly from the Watcher narrative that the Book of Enoch had elaborated from that compressed, puzzling passage in Genesis 6. Jude was writing to Jewish Christians, people formed by exactly the tradition we have been tracing through these three preceding sections. People who knew the Book of Enoch, or knew its ideas, or had absorbed its language through the long chain of transmission that moved through synagogues, homes, hillsides, and market conversations across the Jewish world. For Jude, citing Enoch was not a controversial move requiring elaborate justification. It was a natural appeal to a shared imaginative inheritance, a text that his readers would recognize, whose authority in this specific matter he was comfortable invoking, even without placing it on the level of Torah. This is the paradox made visible. A New Testament writer quotes the Book of Enoch as prophecy, and yet the Book of Enoch never entered the canon. It remained, as it had always been, present, influential, unresolved, known without being trusted, quoted without being canonized, alive in the tradition without being secured within it. To understand why, you have to understand what canonization meant in the first century, which is to say, you have to understand that it meant almost nothing yet, in the formal sense we now attach to the word. The process by which Jewish communities defined their authoritative scriptures was still unfolding in the first century. The Torah, the 5 books of Moses, was uncontested. The prophets were widely accepted. The writings were more fluid. And beyond those categories lay a spectrum of texts that different communities valued differently. Psalms of Solomon, the Book of Jubilees, the Wisdom of Sirach, the Book of Enoch. These were not rejected texts. They were not forbidden texts. They occupied a space for which the first century had no clean vocabulary. Texts that carried weight without carrying authority in the formal, binding sense. The eventual exclusion of Enoch from the Jewish canon, a process that solidified more clearly after the destruction of the Jerusalem Temple in 70 CE, as Rabbinic Judaism worked to define its boundaries with greater precision, was shaped by several factors. The book's claim to pre-Mosaic revelation was one. It positioned itself as older than the law, which raised complicated questions about authority and priority. Its elaboration of angelic mythology was another. The rabbinic tradition, reacting in part against the proliferation of angel speculation in apocalyptic circles and in early Christianity, became increasingly cautious about texts that placed too much weight on angelic intermediaries. And its use by early Christian communities, who found in its Son of Man imagery, its judgment theology, its account of evil spirits, rich resources for understanding Jesus, made it suspect in Jewish eyes precisely because it had become useful to the other side of a deepening divide. But in the first century, before that divide had fully opened, before the temple had fallen and the boundaries had hardened, the Book of Enoch lived in a more fluid world. It was present in Galilee and Judea as a text that serious people knew, that imaginative people absorbed, that desperate people found consoling, and that cautious people kept at a careful distance without quite being able to dismiss. Jesus moved through this world with complete fluency. He never cited the Book of Enoch by name. No gospel records him unrolling an Enochic scroll in a synagogue and reading from it. But the language he chose, the images he reached for, the questions he addressed, all of them were in conversation with the tradition Enoch represented. When he spoke of the Son of Man coming in clouds with great glory, surrounded by angels to gather the elect from the four winds of heaven, he was speaking in a register his hearers recognized, a register that Enoch had helped to shape over centuries of circulation and absorption. When he described Gehenna as the place prepared for the devil and his angels, a place of fire and outer darkness, he was drawing on an imaginative world in which the punishment of fallen spiritual beings was not metaphor, but cosmological fact. When he cast out demons with a word, he was demonstrating an authority over the disordered spiritual world that Enoch's tradition had described in precise, urgent detail. He was not endorsing the Book of Enoch as scripture, but he was not ignorant of it either. He was a first-century Jewish teacher operating within the full texture of his tradition. Canonical and peripheral, authoritative and marginal, settled and disputed, and he spoke from within that texture with a freedom and an authority that consistently exceeded it. This is what the story of the Book of Enoch reveals about the world Jesus inhabited. It was not a simple world of one book, one interpretation, one agreed-upon understanding of how heaven and earth related. It was a world dense with competing texts, layered traditions, urgent questions, and unresolved tensions. A world in which the boundary between the sacred and the merely ancient was genuinely unclear, genuinely contested, and genuinely alive. Into that world, Jesus came, not to resolve every textual debate, not to establish a canonical list, not to adjudicate the status of peripheral books. He came, as the Gospels present him, to do something far more fundamental, to demonstrate, in his own person, in his own words and actions, that the questions Enoch and all of apocalyptic tradition had been asking about justice, about evil, about divine authority, about the final vindication of the suffering righteous, were not destined to remain questions forever. The Book of Enoch had spent centuries describing the throne room of God, the figure who would sit in judgment, the moment when heaven's authority would become visible on earth. It described these things with the urgency of a tradition that believed they were coming, that strained toward them with the full weight of its longing. And then a man stood up in Galilee, beside a lake that reflected the same stars Enoch had described as obedient servants of the divine will, and began to teach. He taught with authority. Not the authority of citation, not the authority of tradition properly transmitted, the authority of someone who knew, from the inside, what all the texts had been reaching toward. The Book of Enoch was known in the time of Jesus. It was not fully trusted. It was not canonized. It was not endorsed. But it had spent centuries preparing a people to recognize something, to feel the shape of a presence before they could name it, to understand a claim before it was fully articulated, to sense that the Son of Man was not merely a figure in an ancient vision, but a living reality walking among them. That is the strange, precise gift of a borderland text in a borderland time. It asks the questions that make the answer recognizable when it finally arrives.